Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. It started as any other Tuesday, the routines in place and the subtle details lining my day like clockwork. But that day, something shifted. The early morning glow filtered through our bedroom, casting soft light on Lisa's side of the bed, empty, though her alarm hadn't gone off yet. I heard her in the kitchen, her voice hushed, speaking low into the phone. I patted down the hall, trying not to eavesdrop, but something in her tone made me pause. It wasn't her usual mom or wife voice, it was soft, intimate. It reminded me of the way she used to speak to me, back when we were newlyweds. I hadn't heard that tone in a long time. A pang of guilt hit me as I realized how much I missed it. I left without confronting her. She kissed me goodbye in her usual rushed manner, not a hint of anything unusual. Work dragged on. A meeting, some deadlines, emails to check, but I couldn't shake the feeling from that morning. I told myself I was overthinking it. Lisa had always been independent, ambitious, the kind of woman who made a point to stay busy. We met in college, and she had this magnetism about her. She'd walk into a room, and it was like the lights shone a little brighter. She was my spark, my energy. But recently, that light seemed dim, her attention scattered. Over the past few months, she'd been leaving for work dinners, a bit more polished, a little more careful with her looks. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. We were adults, we'd been together over a decade. But when she left her phone on the counter one night, something in me couldn't resist. She'd always guarded it, and I hadn't pried. But that night, after she'd gone to bed, I picked it up. Just a quick glance. One name, one message thread, was starred, Greg. There was no mistaking it. I told myself I was reading into things again, that Greg was just a coworker, a name I hadn't heard because she kept her work life separate. Still, the unease remained. I tried to ignore it. I tried to sleep that night, but the images flooded my mind, all the little things she'd said or done, the change in her laugh, the way she'd turn her phone screen downward. All at once, it was as if the small pieces had fallen into place. I'd heard the jokes, the whispered warnings from friends, but never thought they'd apply to us. We were solid, built to last. Or so I thought. Things reached a tipping point on a Sunday. We were driving to meet some friends, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting everything in shades of orange and gold. She asked to make a quick stop at Wawa, saying she needed to use the restroom. When she got out, she left her phone on the passenger seat. My heart raced. I wasn't the kind of man to pry. I'd been raised to trust, to respect boundaries. But the messages, her recent behavior, everything was gnawing at me, demanding answers. As I sat there, my hand moved almost involuntarily. I picked up her phone, not to snoop, I told myself, but just to glance. That's when her screen lit up with a notification, a message from Greg. Before I could process it, I saw Lisa running back from the store, moving faster than I'd ever seen her. She yanked the door open and grabbed the phone from my hand without a word. She offered some half-hearted explanation about forgetting her phone, but we both knew she wasn't fooling anyone. The car ride was silent. I wanted to ask her, to demand answers, but I swallowed it down. I was too shocked, too frozen by what I'd just seen. For the rest of the night, I watched her like a stranger, noticing every gesture, every forced laugh. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore, and her attention drifted as if she were already somewhere else. That night, as she lay next to me, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of our history pressing down. We had built a life together, a home, memories. And now, a shadow hung over everything, tainting the good with suspicion. I couldn't bear the thought of confrontation. Not yet. So I kept quiet, gathering my thoughts, holding on to the hope that maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was all just in my head, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. I felt it like a splinter lodged beneath the skin, something painful, insistent, and impossible to ignore. The next morning, she was up early again, and I watched her, pretending to sleep as she slipped out of bed. I could hear her in the kitchen, her voice low, muttering something under her breath. When she left, I felt relief wash over me, followed immediately by a hollowness I couldn't shake. I was alone in a home we'd built together, a stranger in a life I thought was mine. Days passed, and I felt like a spectator in my own marriage. I watched her come and go, her movements deliberate, careful. She'd smile, make small talk, but there was a distance between us now, an invisible barrier we both felt. I tried to busy myself with work, throwing myself into projects, late nights at the office. Anything to escape the gnawing ache that had taken root in my chest. But then came the day I overheard her on the phone again. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, her laughter foreign. She spoke to him the way she used to speak to me. That was it, the moment the reality hit. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. This was intentional, deliberate. A betrayal. After she hung up, I sat there, numb. I had given her everything, trusted her completely, and here I was, watching my marriage crumble in slow motion. A part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the hurt went too deep. I didn't want an explanation, I wanted justice. I made up my mind that night. I would gather proof, bide my time. If she thought she could pull one over on me, she had another thing coming. I was going to make her regret every lie, every secret. This wasn't going to be a quiet, silent resentment. This was going to be my reckoning, my own way of taking back control of a life that had slipped away. The following day, I hired a private investigator. I wanted no loose ends, no shred of doubt left. I needed to see her actions spelled out in cold, hard evidence, to understand exactly what had become of the woman I thought I knew. In the weeks that followed, I felt as if I was living in a suspense novel, each day exposing another detail that confirmed my worst fears. The investigator had been clear, it would take time to gather definitive proof, to document her actions in a way that couldn't be disputed. But patience was no friend of mine. Each day, I grew more restless, each night more filled with rage as I lay beside her, pretending everything was normal. The first report came in discreetly, an envelope marked "Private," dropped in my mailbox. Inside, a dossier with photographs, details, and times. I sat at the kitchen table, going through it with a strange sense of detachment. The investigator's notes were meticulous, Lisa and Greg at a cafe downtown, laughing over coffee. Lisa and Greg at a restaurant, seated in a corner booth, heads close together. The photos were grainy but clear enough, showing her radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years. The reality, sharp and undeniable, left me staring at the pages with a bitter twist in my gut. Lisa came home that evening, her usual smile plastered on, her eyes flashing over me without a hint of guilt or remorse. She asked about dinner, made small talk, the normal routines that now felt like an insult. As we sat down to eat, I felt every cell in my body clench in anger. But I forced myself to act naturally, responding to her questions, pretending I hadn't spent the last hour looking at photos of her with another man. She was good at keeping up appearances, but so was I. A week later, I received the second report. This time, it was more intimate. A series of images taken outside a hotel in the city. Lisa and Greg, his arm wrapped around her waist as they entered the lobby, the timestamp marking it in the middle of a work trip she'd mentioned casually over breakfast the week before. I could almost hear her voice in my head, her tone light as she mentioned the hotel stay. Just a quick overnight thing, you know how it is. I clenched my fists, remembering her flippant tone, the way she'd leaned in to kiss me goodbye before heading off to meet him. After that, there was no need to wait for more. I had enough evidence to know the truth. It felt like a weight pressing on my chest, heavy and inescapable. I'd heard the term blind rage before, but I never understood it until now. I was barely aware of my movements as I left the house, grabbing my keys and heading to the one place I knew would ground me, the boxing gym where I'd trained on and off for years. I threw myself into the workout, each punch landing hard, sweat pouring down as I pushed myself to exhaustion. When I left, my hands were shaking, my body sore, but my mind was calm. I had a plan. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparations. I began quietly securing my finances, meeting with a lawyer who specialized in divorces. I kept a low profile, not mentioning any of it to Lisa, though the desire to confront her grew stronger each day. Instead, I became colder, more distant, knowing that it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. I spent the nights thinking through every detail of my plan. The party would be my stage, the place where I'd finally lay everything bare. It was coming up in a few weeks, a big family gathering that we hosted every year, and I knew it would be the perfect opportunity. I could have confronted her alone, but that wasn't enough. I wanted her to see the ripple effects of her betrayal, to feel the shame as our friends and family watched her lies unravel. In the meantime, I became a ghost in my own life. Friends asked if I was okay, noticing my quieter demeanor, but I brushed off their concern. Lisa seemed oblivious, wrapped up in her own world. I watched her go through her daily routines, each smile, each laugh fueling the storm building inside me. It was surreal, seeing her continue as if nothing had changed, as if we were still the perfect couple. One evening, I found myself alone in our room, flipping through our wedding album. I hadn't opened it in years, but there it was, tucked away in the closet, a relic of a different time. I stared at the photos, at the happiness that radiated from each image. It felt like looking at strangers. The man in those photos, smiling with such innocence and pride, that man was gone. The woman beside him, smiling just as brightly, felt like a stranger. I closed the album and set it aside, feeling nothing but a hollow ache where love had once been. The night of the party arrived sooner than I'd expected. I'd gone over the plan in my head 1,000 times, every word, every step. I was ready. Lisa was busy getting ready in the bathroom, picking out an outfit with her usual enthusiasm. She seemed excited, chattering on about the evening, oblivious to the storm brewing. As I watched her, a wave of sadness hit me, the reality of what was about to happen. But then I remembered the photos, the texts, the way she'd casually lied to me time and again. My resolve hardened. As guests began to arrive, I went into host mode, greeting family and friends, playing my part. Lisa was in her element, laughing, mingling, the center of attention. I watched her, a strange detachment settling over me. This was the life she was willing to throw away, the home we'd built together, the friends we'd shared. She had no idea what was coming. By the time everyone was settled, drinks in hand, I decided it was time. I stood at the front of the room, raising my glass, calling for everyone's attention. Lisa turned to look at me, a smile on her face, her eyes shining with anticipation. To my beautiful wife, I began, my voice steady, but laced with an edge that made a few people shift in their seats. The woman who has brought so much joy and laughter into my life. Lisa's smile faltered slightly, a hint of confusion flashing across her face. I held her gaze, watching the realization dawn. And I want to extend a special toast to Greg, I continued, my tone sharp. For bringing so much, extra excitement into Lisa's life. Silence fell over the room. I could see the shock ripple through the crowd, the wide eyes, the murmurs as people began to understand. Lisa's face went pale, her mouth opening in horror. I know, I said simply, watching her world crumble in real time. I know everything. I waited a beat, letting the words sink in, feeling a dark satisfaction as the truth unfolded around her. The room fell into a stunned silence, eyes darting between Lisa and me, some filled with shock, others with pity. I saw my brother-in-law's face drop, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth. Lisa's mother gasped softly, her hand over her heart. And then there was Lisa herself, standing there like she'd been struck, her mouth slightly open, words seemingly trapped in her throat. This wasn't a small dinner, this was a celebration, a family gathering we hosted every year. We'd invited everyone, friends, family, colleagues. And they all heard. The silence was heavy, stretching on, giving weight to every unspoken thought. Then someone awkwardly cleared their throat, and the low hum of murmurs filled the room. The people who knew Lisa the best, who had always thought the world of her, looked at her with disbelief, confusion, and something bordering on disappointment. She looked around, searching for understanding, maybe hoping someone would save her from this. But this was no time for her usual charm. Finally, Lisa found her voice, her eyes meeting mine, filled with a desperation I hadn't seen before. "Please, can we talk privately?" she whispered, reaching out to me. But I held my ground, rooted in place, letting the weight of her actions hang in the air between us. "Oh, now you want privacy?" I asked, keeping my tone even, though I could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "After everything, now you want to keep this between us?" Her cheeks flushed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She looked around helplessly, aware that every eye in the room was on her. "Please, let's talk about this," she managed, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, not with the love I used to feel, but with the clarity that comes when trust is shattered beyond repair. I could have walked away then, let her scramble for explanations and excuses, but I wanted her to face the full reality of her betrayal. So, I leaned in, my voice low but cold. "Why don't you explain it to everyone, Lisa? Tell them about your little work dinners with Greg, the hotel overnights. You've had plenty of practice lying." Her face went ashen, and she shook her head slowly, as if by sheer denial she could make this all go away. But I wasn't done. "For years, I gave you everything I had. I trusted you. I loved you." My voice grew firmer, words spilling out faster now. "And you lied. Over and over again, you chose him over me, over us. You made your choice, Lisa. I'm just making sure everyone knows who you really are." The tension in the room was unbearable, and I could see our friends and family shift uncomfortably, some of them exchanging uneasy glances. A few friends looked at Lisa with disdain, others with sadness. This was the public unmasking of someone they had thought was trustworthy, dependable. The silence that followed was a crushing reminder of the reality she tried to keep hidden, and now she couldn't escape it. Suddenly, she turned and walked swiftly toward the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile in a way that seemed louder in the heavy silence. The door swung shut behind her, and I could hear her muffled sobs. A few sympathetic guests started after her, but most stayed put, avoiding my gaze, uncertain of what to do or say. I stayed by the fireplace, hands resting on the mantel, feeling a strange calm. I expected the release of finally exposing the truth to feel triumphant, but instead, there was a dull ache, a hollow feeling that didn't go away. I took a slow breath and glanced around the room, catching the eyes of some of our closest friends. They looked back at me, expressions mixed, support, shock, and pity all tangled together. My brother-in-law, Todd, approached quietly. "Hey, man," he said, his voice low. "Are you doing okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "I'm alright, Todd. Thanks." He put a hand on my shoulder, squeezing it firmly before stepping back, glancing in the direction Lisa had gone. "Look, I don't know what to say," he stammered, shaking his head. I had no idea." "No one did," I replied, my voice more bitter than I intended. "She hid it well. Almost too well." Todd looked down, clearly as uncomfortable as everyone else. "If there's anything you need." I nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing that there was nothing anyone could do. This was a mess only Lisa and I could untangle, though any hope of resolution had faded long ago. As guests trickled out, I thanked them for coming, keeping my voice steady, though I knew this would be the last time we'd gather like this in our home. A few offered whispered words of support, others gave me sympathetic looks, but all were visibly shaken, as if the betrayal had rippled out, touching each of them in some way. They were saying goodbye not only to the evening but to the version of Lisa they'd thought they knew. Once the last guest had left, I stood alone in the empty, silent room. The decorations Lisa had put up, the candles she'd arranged so carefully, seemed like relics from another life. I felt drained, the anger that had sustained me for weeks dissipating, leaving behind only exhaustion. I made my way to the kitchen, where Lisa still sat at the small breakfast table, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. I stood in the doorway, watching her, feeling strangely detached. She looked up, eyes red and swollen, and there was something vulnerable in her expression that almost softened me. Almost. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple, desperate question. I needed to understand how we'd gone from the happiness in our wedding photos to this, to her betrayal and my broken heart. She took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping at her eyes. I don't know, Tom. I don't have an answer. It just happened. That's not good enough, I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. We had a life together, a good life. And you threw it all away. For what? She looked down, twisting a napkin in her hands, unable to meet my gaze. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But you did, I replied sharply. Over and over again. You could have stopped. You could have told me the truth. But instead, you let me believe we were still okay while you went behind my back. Her shoulders shook as fresh tears filled her eyes. I know, and I hate myself for it. I was selfish. I don't know what I was thinking. But I don't want to lose you. Please, can we find a way to fix this? I let out a bitter laugh, feeling a sharp pang of disbelief. Fix this? How can I ever trust you again, Lisa? How could I ever look at you and not remember the lies, the betrayal? She reached out for my hand, but I pulled back, not ready to let her touch me, not after everything. I watched her expression crumble, the realization of what she'd done finally hitting her in full force. The weight of it all was too much to bear, and I stepped back, shaking my head. I think you should go, Lisa, I said quietly, my voice steady but final. There's nothing left to save here. She looked up at me, a flicker of hope still in her eyes, as if she thought I might relent, but I held her gaze, unyielding. Finally, she nodded, a defeated look settling over her face. Without another word, she rose from the table and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. When the door clicked shut behind her, I was alone in our home, our life shattered around me. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands, the weight of everything crashing down on me. In the silence, I let myself feel the full impact of what had happened, the raw pain of betrayal, and the reality that my life, as I knew it, was gone. The days after Lisa left blurred together, each one passing with a dull ache that gnawed at my chest. I kept to myself, avoiding calls from friends and family, avoiding the spaces in the house that felt too painfully like her. I had gone through the anger and the sadness, but now, all that was left was emptiness. I hadn't known what life would look like after the confrontation, after I'd thrown her betrayal into the open for everyone to see. But somehow, I hadn't expected it to feel this hollow. It was nearly a month later when I got a call from Lisa's mother, Lorraine. I hadn't spoken to her since the party, and I could hear the weight in her voice as soon as she said hello. Tom, she began, her voice thick. I know things have been difficult, but I thought you should know. Lisa isn't doing well. I gripped the phone tighter, a strange, reluctant concern gnawing at me. Despite everything, I still felt a pull toward her, an instinct that I wished I could shake. What do you mean? I asked, struggling to keep my tone steady. She hasn't been herself, Lorraine continued, hesitating. Since that night, she's been staying with me. She barely eats, barely sleeps. It's like a light has gone out in her. I know what she did was unforgivable, but I don't think she expected to lose you. To lose everything. I closed my eyes, the bitterness I'd tried to shed rising up again. She made her choice, Lorraine. She knew what she was risking. I know, Lorraine replied softly, and I could tell she was holding back tears. But she's still my daughter. And I know she's hurting. I just thought you should know. Maybe you could talk to her. One last time. The word struck me, twisting my chest. I wanted to refuse, to let her live with the pain she'd caused, to let her feel what I'd been feeling all these months. But as much as I tried to harden myself, I couldn't forget the life we'd shared. A part of me still felt responsible for her, even after everything. I don't know, Lorraine, I said, struggling against the instinct to give in. I don't know if I'm ready to face her again. Please, Tom, she whispered. I don't think she'll make it if she doesn't get a chance to talk to you. Those words hung in the air, leaving a strange fear in their wake. There was a finality to them that I couldn't ignore. I knew that this conversation was Lorraine's last plea, a desperate attempt to save her daughter from something I hadn't anticipated. Before I could think twice, I agreed. The next day, I found myself driving toward Lorraine's house, my heart racing with a mix of dread and something I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to turn the car around, to let her live with her choices, to let her sit with the weight of her mistakes. But another part of me needed closure. I needed to see her one last time, to lay everything to rest. When I arrived, Lorraine met me at the door, her face lined with worry. She led me to the small room where Lisa was staying, her hand on my shoulder as if to steady us both. She's been waiting for you, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Lisa was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and hollow, a shadow of the woman I'd once known. Her hair was unkempt, her face drawn, and the usual confidence that defined her was nowhere to be found. She looked up at me, a flicker of something, hope, regret, desperation, shining briefly in her eyes before it faded. Tom, she whispered, her voice cracked and broken. Thank you for coming. I nodded, standing a few feet away, keeping my distance. Your mom said you wanted to talk. She took a shuddering breath, her hands shaking as she reached up to wipe a tear from her cheek. I don't even know where to begin, she said. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know I have no right to ask for it. But I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. The words felt hollow, empty in the face of what had happened. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. Sorry doesn't change what you did, Lisa. You tore apart everything we built together. You lied to me, again and again. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And I can never undo it. But please believe me, Tom, it wasn't about you. It was something broken inside me. Something I didn't know how to fix. And now, I have to live with it. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret, and for the first time, I saw her pain, the raw, aching regret that mirrored my own. She was suffering in a way I hadn't anticipated, a way that felt almost as shattering as my own pain. I'm not here to make you feel better, Lisa, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. I came because I needed to see you for who you really are. I came to remind myself that we're done, that there's nothing left to salvage. She nodded, her face crumpling, and for a brief, aching moment, I felt the urge to hold her, to comfort her despite everything. But I held back, knowing that the time for comfort had passed. A silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. I took a step back, ready to leave, to walk away from the wreckage of what we'd once had. But as I turned to go, she spoke again, her voice soft and broken. Please, Tom, she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. I don't want to be alone. I don't know if I can do this without you. I stopped, my heart clenching at her words, feeling the sharp pain of a wound that hadn't fully healed. I turned back, my gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd loved, the woman who had once been my everything. "I can't be there for you, Lisa," I said softly. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the finality of my words settling over us both. I didn't look back. I left her there, alone in that room, knowing that it was the end of everything we'd ever shared. But as I drove home, a strange feeling settled over me, a weight pressing down on my chest that refused to lift. It felt like grief, like a hollow ache that I couldn't shake, no matter how far I drove. 2 days later, I received a call from Lorraine. "She's gone, Tom," she whispered, her voice broken, her sobs filling the silence. "Lisa, she took her life." The words hit me like a blow, leaving me breathless, my mind reeling. I sank to the floor, feeling a darkness wrap around me as the reality of what had happened settled in. She was gone. Lisa was gone. And I'd left her alone. In that moment, the anger, the bitterness, all of it vanished, replaced by a sorrow that filled every corner of my being. I had wanted justice, had wanted her to feel the pain she'd caused. But I never imagined it would end like this. I never imagined that my revenge would come at the ultimate cost. Now, all I had left were memories, of the life we'd built, of the laughter we'd shared, and of the love that had once felt unbreakable. And in the silence that followed, I felt a grief that would haunt me for the rest of my life.